Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Abam. We have a major Sugya, and we're going to try to do it quickly. The Gemara said on Daf Pevav, the Gemara had a question on Rav Papa. Let me see if I could put it up on the screen here. Okay, here we go. The Gemara had a question on Rav Papa. Rav Kahana, Amarle Rav Kahana Rav Papa. By the way, today's Shiur is dedicated by my dear friend Reb Kenneth Pinsauer, Le'iloi Nishmas, his father, whose yahrzeit is today, Yisrael Chaim ben Ephraim. Shama Sham Naliyah, he should be a Meilutz Yoshev for his whole family, for Simchas Hanachas, Besuros Toivos, Ad Bias Gold Tzedek. The Gemara has a very interesting question. Rav Kahana asked Rav Papa, according to you who says paying a debt is a mitzvah, what does it mean it's a mitzvah? It's a mitzvah to pay a debt. And a mitzvah meaning, and simply, there's no monetary obligation. There's no monetary obligation. It's a mitzvah to pay a debt. What if the guy says, you know what, I'm not in the mood of doing mitzvahs today. I'll do a mitzvah when my debt is, let's say, $1. But if my debt is $1 million, I prefer not to do that mitzvah. Says the Gemara, how do you pay a debt? What's the responsibility? What's the liability to pay back a debt? So this is the question Rav Kahana asked Rav Papa. Rav Papa said back, Amarle Tanina, Bamedva Mamram b'mitzvah slay saseh. You know when there are 39 malchus? When someone violates a lav. Ava mitzvah saseh, by mitzvah saseh, for example, we tell somebody, make a sukkah and he doesn't want to, lulav he doesn't want to, we hit someone ad shetetzei nafshay. So if we're going to hit someone to fulfill a mitzvah saseh until his soul departs, we'll also force him to pay back. Let's focus on the Gemara's question. According to you, Rav Papa, you say paying back a debt is a mitzvah. Yeah, as opposed to what? What's the alternative? The alternative is that when you lend someone money, it creates a lien on his property. He has financial liability to pay. So presumably, the opinion that Priyas Bal Chayv Mitzvah holds that there is no financial liability, there's no financial responsibility, it's merely a mitzvah. It's like shaking a lulav, it's like sitting in a sukkah, it's like wearing tefillin. So if a guy doesn't want to do the mitzvah, what recourse does the Bezdin have to ensure that he fulfills the mitzvah? Meaning it seems like if you hold Priyas Bal Chayv Mitzvah, there is no financial liability, it's merely a religious responsibility. Well, what if the guy doesn't want to fulfill that? Now let's first focus for a moment, what is the mitzvah of paying back a debt if there's no lien, if there's no shibud? Rashi says the mitzvah is la'ames devarav. Here, look at Rashi. Rashi says, la'ames devarav, to make your word true. D'chsev hin tzedek, that your yes should be righteous. Sheyehei hein shelcha tzedek, v'lav shelcha tzedek. Your yes should be righteous. Your no should be righteous. Okay? The Ritva, on the other hand, quotes a different pasuk, by the way. It's very interesting.
This week's Parsha.
The Ritva quotes a pasuk. Perish Rashi midachsiv hin tzedek v'darshinan shehei hin shalcha tzedek v'hikshala b'toisvis dahi ha'okimna b'bab metzia l'inyan shel yadaber echa b'peh v'echa b'leiv. Hin shalcha tzedek means you shouldn't be a hypocrite. V'ilo hacha pivali b'hein shavin. But a guy who doesn't want to pay back, his mouth and heart are not contradictory. He doesn't want to pay, and he says he doesn't want to pay. Kishalava lefraya v'heim shavim achshav shaloi lefraya. Originally, when he borrowed, he wanted to borrow, and now he doesn't want to pay. Lekach pirish ri de nafkalei midachsiv ha'ish asher ata noishaba yoytzi alecha so'avoid. That the person who owes you money has to bring out the loan, has to bring out what the item that's owed. But u'mitzvah ba'ama huladidei, it's only a mitzvah for him. The mitzvah is ha'ish asher ata noisha bai. The man who you owe to, the man who owes has to bring out the debt. So that's the mitzvah, not sheyeh hin shalcha tzedek, which is basically a pella. What Rashi means, in fact, the l'chayra Rabbi Kiva Eger is bothered by this question when Rabbi Kiva Eger says, "Looking ba mitzia daf mem tesam and aleph va'ayin sham v'tzarchi and katan," because the Gemara comes out not like that. It's sheyeh pivli by shavim. But in any event, Rashi seems to be learning, and the Ritva seems to be learning that according to Rav Papa, if you hold shibud is not d'oraisa, the responsibility to pay a debt is merely religious. If that's the case, what recourse does Bezin have to ensure that somebody pays back? And the answer is they could beat the living daylights out of the guy, which doesn't mean they do. It means if they're able to, then they certainly could enforce the fulfillment of a mitzvah. In other words, the Gemara's conclusion would then seem to be that there is no financial responsibility, but the recourse is Bezin has the ability to enforce the performance of a mitzvah. So what exactly does this mean? Priyas bal chayv mitzvah, and there's no shibud at all? So the Ritva says, yeah. The Ritva says, u'mitzvah ba'alma hula didei. It's merely a mitzvah for someone to pay back a loan. The shibuda lavda iraisa. There is no biblical shibud. There's no biblical shibud. You borrow money from someone, simply you have no biblical financial responsibility. It's merely a mitzvah. So the question is, so then what recourse does somebody have if the guy says, you know what, I don't want to observe this mitzvah. Now, the Ritva in Masechta Kedushin, also he says it's mistaber that even though Shmuel holds shibud is lav d'oraisa, he would agree it's still a mitzvah, and it's a mitzvah where kaifen, like the Gemara in Kesuvos says on Daf Pevav. And the Ritva explains, mitzvah ba'alma v'lav shibuda. It's a mitzvah, but it's not a shibud. What if the guy doesn't want to fulfill the mitzvah? Says the Gemara, we know that by mitzvah sasei kaifen oisai ad shatetze nafshai. So too here, we force him until he says hachanami kaifen oisai va'ad sha'ata kaifeo begufai, instead of physically forcing him kaifeo b'mamaynai. We force him with his money, kivan de mitzvah de mamaynai. It's a mitzvah. It's not a financial responsibility, it's a monetary responsibility. Now, just as an aside, the Rosh argues with the Ritva. The Rosh holds that Rav Papa holds shibud is d'oraisa. So if shibud is d'oraisa, what's the Gemara's question? What recourse do we have to collect a debt if priyas bal chayv mitzvah? But Rav Papa himself, the Rosh says, Rav Papa says in Kedushin Yud Gimel Amud Beis, milva al peh goiva min hayarshin. A milva al peh you could collect from yarshim, because shibud is d'oraisa. And Rav Papa says in Shum HaYisaimim that we do not go down to the nechasim of Yisaimim Ketanim. Why? Because Priyas Bal Chayv is a mitzvah, and Yisaimim are not responsible to do mitzvahs when they're Ketanim, which implies that when they're Gedolim, we do force them to pay, because shibud is d'oraisa. The Rosh says the Gemara's kasha is, well, that's very nice, shibud is d'oraisa, but what if the loiva doesn't have karka? So then what do we do? What do we do then? So the Rosh learns that Rav Papa agrees shibud is d'oraisa, but hacha b'mayaskinan, where the loiva doesn't have karka. But the Ritva disagrees. The Ritva says that the shita of Priyas Bal Chayv mitzvah holds shibud is not d'oraisa. Okay, and the only responsibility someone has to pay a debt is a religious responsibility. So comes Rabbi Elchanan, and Rabbi Elchanan asks a bamba on the Ritva. If you hold, like the Ritva, that shibud is not d'oraisa? Could somebody please tell me? If somebody dies, do their heirs have to pay their debt? Of course. Why? They inherit a mitzvah? You can't inherit a mitzvah. You can inherit money. You can't inherit an obligation to do a mitzvah. If Priyas Bal Chayv is just a mitzvah, then why would an heir have to pay back a debt? Says Rabbi Elchanan, Lamanda Amar Shibuda Lav Da'iraisa Parch B'Gemara Kesuvos, that Amar Loi Nichalei Lameben Mitzvah Mayu Mashani Makenoisai At Shetetzei Nafshai Mashma Mized Lahach Man Amar Leka Chiyav Mamayin Ela Mitzvah Greda V'Kashanim Kein Eich Yorish Yorsha Dolei Shaycha Yerusha Ela B'Schus Mamayin. What obligation does an heir have to pay a debt? You hear the question? Why would an heir have to pay back a debt? Aval hadavar pashat, says Rabbi Elchanan. Rabbi Elchanan is a big chiddush. Rabbi Elchanan says that even the man Amar that shibud derabanan and priyas bal chayv mitzvah, you still have a financial responsibility to pay. Where do you think the mitzvah comes from? What's the mitzvah then? If there's no financial responsibility to pay, there can be no mitzvah. The mitzvah is to take care of the financial responsibility. So you say, says Rabbi Elchanan, Aval hadavar pashat. Kivan da mitzvah hi priyas bal chayv. If the mitzvah is to pay back the debt, al kachat the ika bal chayv, kaidam mitzvah, there has to be a debt before the mitzvah. Shara mitzvah hi lefrayas chayv. The mitzvah is to pay the debt. Vilu loy haya chayv. If there would not be a chayv loy hoysa mitzvah klal, there would be no mitzvah at all. V'hachiluk bein mitzvah zu l'shar chiyuvei mitzvah. The chiluk between this mitzvah and other mitzvahs is other mitzvahs. The obligation stems from the mitzvah. Since you have to take a lulav and esrog, you need to buy it. Over here, it's the opposite. The mitzvah stems from the financial responsibility. Here the mitzvah is an offshoot of the obligation. And other obligations of mitzvah, the obligation is an offshoot of the mitzvah. Since there is a chayv even without the mitzvah, Yerusha, there could be inheritance. You can't say you're not my bal davar. So there is a financial responsibility. The only thing is, if shibud is not the iraisa, it is not a financial responsibility that we could enforce. Okay, Shibud lav da'iraisa means that even though you have a monetary financial responsibility, but there doesn't create a lien. Says Rabbi Elchanan, even though the Ritva learns that the Shita that holds Priyas Bal Chayv mitzvah, that doesn't mean it's just a mitzvah and there's no financial responsibility. Of course there's a financial responsibility. It's just not an enforceable one. That's the Chiddush of Rabbi Elchanan, and Rav Shimon Shkab says the same idea. Okay? So we've arrived at something very important. That even though the Ritva learns the Gemara, that the Shita that holds Priyas Bal Chayv mitzvah, even though it holds Shibud is not D'oraisa, Shibud not D'oraisa doesn't mean there's no monetary obligation. There is a monetary obligation. It's just it's not enforceable. With this, it comes out two amazing nafkaminos halacha. Question. According to the man the Amar Priyas Bal Chayv mitzvah, what if you borrowed $1 million? What if you borrowed $1 million and it's more than a fifth of your assets? Are you now exempt from the mitzvah because you don't have to spend more than 1/5 of your money on a mitzvah? That's the question of Reb Chaim Brisker. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik asks, what if you have no money and you borrowed all the money you have? But if the only reason you have to pay back is because Priyas B'Chai Mitzvah, that Hen Shachat Tzedek, but you only have to spend up to a fifth of your money on a mitzvah, so why would the loiva have to pay? So what would you answer to this question? This whole question is predicated on the way we learned the Ritva originally. That Priyas B'Chai Mitzvah means the only obligation to pay is religious. But the way Rabbi Elchanan learns the Ritva is that of course there's a financial obligation to pay. It's not enforceable. There's no, Shibud is the Rabbanan, Shibud is not the Raisa. And the only obligation, the only enforceable element is the mitzvah. But how do we force someone to Mekayim a mitzvah? So according to this, says Reb Scheinberg, that of course there's a financial obligation to pay. It's just not enforceable. Then if somebody borrowed $1 million, even though it's more than a fifth of his money, of course he's going to have to pay. Oh, but you don't have to do a mitzvah for more than a fifth of your money. That's not the only obligation you have here. Of course you have a financial obligation. The mitzvah is enforcing the financial obligation. But the obligation... so now I would ask the following Lomdus Shakasha. You ready for this? It's a good thing you came today. I don't know if your grandmother had a daven well for you here, this kasha, but maybe your great aunt or something. Okay? This is a bamba. So we've answered Reb Chaim's question. We've said, well, you know why if somebody borrowed up to all of his money, he would have to pay back? But it's more than 1/5, because the obligation here is a financial obligation. Therefore, you have to take care of your financial obligation. But here's my question. What if somebody borrowed all of his money and he says, I don't want to pay back? So the Gemara says, well, we could force him because we could force someone to be Mekayim a mitzvah. Well, wait a second. But it's more than a fifth of his money. And could we enforce someone? In other words, what's the reason why somebody has to pay back more than a fifth of his money? That's because of the financial obligation. But the Gemara's question is, how could we enforce it? To which the Gemara says, we could enforce it because it's a mitzvah. But it's not a mitzvah more than a fifth. So basically, would we have any way to enforce somebody to pay back a debt in a situation where it's more than a fifth of his money? Or do we say, look, it is a mitzvah, so we can enforce? No. Or do we say it's a mitzvah that the religious aspect he would be exempt from? The only thing that obligates him is the financial, and that's not something that we can enforce. So I would ask, how do we go about enforcing? I would, so to speak, take Reb Chaim's question to the next level. Meaning we've answered Reb Chaim's question. Reb Chaim's question again is, if Priyas B'Chai is a mitzvah, then how could somebody pay back more than a fifth of his money? To which Reb Scheinberg says, well, don't you know Rabbi Elchanan? There is still a financial obligation, but that's not enforceable. So how would we enforce somebody on more than a fifth? That would be my question. Next, this is Oyam V'Naira. Shiur Sechuvas Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Shal Sechuvas Be'er Yitzchak, and the answer of Rav Aaron Kotler. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to write a Sefer Torah. What if somebody writes a Sefer Torah and he loses it? Are you still yotzei the mitzvah? I would have said no. Because the mitzvah is not to write a Sefer Torah. You know how I know that? Because if you write a Sefer Torah and you give it to a shul, you lose the mitzvah of Kesuvos Sefer Torah. Because you don't own it anymore. Many people think that when they give it to a shul and they make a shtar, that they could take it back at any time. They do that so that the shul doesn't claim it's theirs. That's not the reason they do that. They do that because if they don't make a shtar, they lose the mitzvah of Kesuvos Sefer Torah because they don't own it anymore. The mitzvah is to own a Sefer Torah. However, if you inherit a Sefer Torah, you also don't get the mitzvah because the mitzvah is to own a Sefer Torah that came about through your writing. Fine. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan says that if you lose a Sefer Torah, you're still mekayim the mitzvah of Kesuvos Sefer Torah. He says, you know what the proof is? What if you owe somebody $50,000 and you can't pay back? So the halacha is they're allowed to come to your house and take away your Sefer Torah as a payment. You know that? That if you owe a debt, the halacha is in Shulchan Aruch, you owe somebody money, so if you have a Sefer Torah, you'll have to give them a Sefer Torah to pay back the debt. As Rabbi Elchanan, according to the opinion that paying a debt is a mitzvah, why does the mitzvah of paying a debt take precedence over the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah? In other words, if by giving away a Sefer Torah you lose the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, then why are you allowed to pay a debt by giving someone a Sefer Torah? Why is the mitzvah of paying a debt more important than the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah? It must be you still get the mitzvah of having written a Sefer Torah even if you gave it away. Now, I would challenge the question on its premise. You know why the mitzvah of paying a debt takes precedence over writing a Sefer Torah? Because why should that guy suffer because you want to be a big tzaddik and have a Sefer Torah? That's your problem that you're going to lose the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. Meanwhile, this guy wants his money back. So I guess the question is, well, he has no way to enforce that, because you could say, I don't want to give it to you because I don't want to lose my mitzvah. So Rabbi Elchanan says it must be you don't lose the mitzvah of Ksivas Sefer Torah if you give someone a Sefer Torah. Comes Rabbi Kotler, and Rabbi Kotler says, according to the way we're understanding the Ritva, there's no raya of Rabbi Elchanan. Why? You know why? The mitzvah, really I'll tell you, if you give away a Sefer Torah, you lose the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. So why does the mitzvah of paying a debt take precedence over writing a Sefer Torah? Very simply, because aside from the mitzvah of paying a debt, you have a financial responsibility to pay the guy. Oh, but I thought we're in the Manda Amar, Priyas Bal Chayv Mitzvah, and I don't have a financial. No, you have a financial responsibility. It's just not enforceable. So if you wanted to know, why do we give precedence to the mitzvah of paying a debt over writing a Sefer Torah? It's because besides the religious aspects over here, you have financial responsibility. This is the chiddush of Rabbi Elchanan. This is the chiddush of Reb Shimon Shkop, that even according to Rav Papa, that Priyas Bal Chayv mitzvah, again, the Rosh learns there is Shibud D'Oraisa, but according to the Ritva that Shibud is not D'Oraisa, there is still financial responsibility. Okay, we're going to hold it over here. This is the Rabbi Aaron Kotler says, according to this Rabbi Elchanan, it would be we'd be able to knock off the proof of Rabbi Elchanan. Okay, thank you very much for joining again. Today's show was sponsored by Reb Kenneth Pinsauer, Leiloi Nishmas, his father, whose yahrzeit is today, Yisrael Chaim ben Ephraim, Began Eden Teim Nuchasai. Thank you very much. Yeah, Shkoyach. It was a good one, by the way. Good Lomdus. Have a good day, everyone. Shkoyach.
Rob, can I have your Parsha?
Sure.
So something on the Parsha.
Okay, yeah, fine. 1 second. Yep.